Good evening, everyone. Tonight we take a journey back in time. It was the summer of 1941 when Anna first saw Luca. She was a librarian in a quiet town, tucked away from the war that thundered in the distance. Her days were spent amidst the smell of old books, the hum of turning pages, and the soft murmur of the patrons. She tried to keep herself busy, hoping that if she kept moving, she wouldn't think about the brothers, friends, and neighbours who had all gone to the front lines. One afternoon, the town square filled with people. A small convoy of soldiers had arrived to restock and regroup, and for a moment, there was life in the streets again. She stood by the library's window, watching as weary soldiers climbed from their trucks, laughing and joking in a way that felt strange, even surreal in these times. That was when she noticed him, Luca. He wasn't like the others, who clapped each other on the back and joked loudly to mask their exhaustion. Instead, he lingered on the edges of the group, his gaze somber, as if lost in thought. Something about him drew her in. Perhaps it was the shadow in his eyes, or the way he looked up at the town's clock tower with a hint of longing, as though he was thinking of home. The soldiers dispersed, and Anna returned to her quiet corner, assuming she would never see him again. But later that evening, as the streets emptied, she heard a knock on the library door. It was nearly closing time, but when she opened it, she found Luca standing there, hat in hand, with a sheepish smile. "I hope I'm not too late," he said, glancing around at the rows of books. "I haven't read much since the war started, so I thought I'd try and borrow something." There was something gentle in his voice, a softness that surprised her. She invited him in, and as they walked through the aisles, she learned that he had once been a teacher, and that he loved poetry and philosophy, and that he had been pulled into the war reluctantly, but fought with all he had because he believed in something better. That night, as they sat on the library steps under the stars, they shared stories of their childhoods, their fears, their dreams of peace. They laughed over little things, like how Luca's first classroom had been a drafty attic with more dust than desks, and how Anna had once hidden in her library's basement just to finish a novel undisturbed. They didn't know then that this would become a ritual. Every time Luca's convoy stopped through the town, he would find his way to the library, always late at night, always after hours, and Anna would be waiting. Their connection grew quietly, slipping between words and glances, as if the world outside no longer existed. They spoke of the future with unspoken promises, making plans they knew were impossible under the circumstances. They shared books and letters, and once, on a particularly quiet night, he even recited a poem he had written for her. But their world was always on borrowed time. One morning, when she arrived to open the library, Anna found a letter tucked in the door. It was from Luca, scrawled hastily, telling her that he had been ordered back to the front lines. There was no time for goodbyes. The last line read, "Wait for me. I'll come back to you." For a long time after that, Anna tried to find traces of him, but the war seemed determined to erase their memories. She would reread his letter and walk through the places they had been, clutching the quiet moments they had shared. Seasons changed, and life went on. She saw soldiers return to families, lovers find each other again, Yet there was never any word of Luca. Anna tried to move forward, though a part of her stayed with him in that library, waiting. She married briefly, a brief companionship that gave her comfort but never filled the emptiness left by Luca. She found solace in teaching young children about poetry, often using the words he'd once spoken to her. Decades passed. Anna, now a widow with silver hair and lines around her eyes, moved to a new town for a veterans event. She thought it might bring some closure, perhaps a familiar face from those days who could tell her what had happened to Luca. It was a quiet town, peaceful, the type of place she would have liked to live with him. On a crisp autumn morning, Anna arrived at a veterans' remembrance gathering in a quiet town near the sea. She was hesitant to attend at first. The memories were so old now, faded at the edges, like sepia-tone photographs. Yet, something in her heart urged her to go. She walked through the park where the event was held, her footsteps slow, her cane tapping against the stones. The park was filled with people, older men in faded uniforms, women with medals pinned to their coats, families who came to remember those lost. She looked at each face, and though she told herself she wasn't hoping to find anyone in particular, deep down, she felt the familiar ache of wondering about Luca. As she passed a small table with a display of old photographs, she noticed a man looking at one particular picture with a faraway gaze. She didn't recognize him at first. Time had changed them both. His shoulders were slumped, his hair mostly grey, and he leaned heavily on a cane. But when he turned, his eyes met hers, and she froze. They were Luca's eyes, the same ones she had seen by candlelight in the library, and the same ones that had held that promise all those years ago. They both stood still for a moment, the world around them blurring. Anna's hand went to her mouth, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. She didn't know if she should walk to him or wait, afraid that if she moved, he might disappear. But then he smiled, a soft, warm smile, and she knew it was him. "Anna," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, as if he couldn't quite believe it. She nodded, her own voice caught in her throat. She took a trembling step forward, and he did the same, until they were standing close enough to touch. Without a word, she reached out, taking his hand in hers. His hands were rougher now, the hands of a man who had worked through many hard years, but they were still familiar. She looked up into his face, seeing the lines and creases that life had etched there, and yet, to her, he was still the man who had once recited poetry to her by the library steps. "I thought I'd lost you," she managed to say, her voice breaking. Luca squeezed her hand and lowered his head, his voice thick with emotion. "I tried, Anna. I tried to come back to you." They found a quiet bench in the park and sat side by side, their hands still joined, as if they couldn't bear to let them go again. Luca told her how he had survived the war but had been captured in its final months. He had spent years as a prisoner in a far-off camp, where there was no way to write, no way to reach anyone. When he was finally released, he returned to the town where they'd met, but the library was closed, and no one seemed to know where she had gone. "I searched for you," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "I went to every town I thought you might have gone to, but the world was so different after the war. People were moving, rebuilding. I tried to move on, but I couldn't forget. I never stopped thinking about you. Anna's heart ached as she listened, picturing the long, lonely years he had endured, each of them believing the other might be lost forever. She told him of her own life, the days she had spent looking out the library window, hoping he would appear, the letter he had left her that she still kept, folded and worn, how she had eventually married, though her heart had never truly moved on. They sat in silence, absorbing the years, the missed moments, the lives they had led apart. It was a silence that held all the words they hadn't said, the years they had lost. And yet, holding his hand now, Anna realized that even though they'd been apart, they had somehow carried each other through all that time. Luca turned to her, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I'm sorry it took so long," he whispered, his voice heavy with regret. Anna shook her head, gently brushing the tear away. "No more apologies, Luca. You're here now, and that's all that matters." As they sat on the bench under the gathering twilight, Anna and Luca spoke in hushed voices, retracting the path of their lives since they had last seen each other. It had been 45 years since that final letter, the one Luca had left for her at the library door. 45 years. The number hung heavy between them, almost too large to grasp. It felt unreal, and yet, looking into each other's faces, they could see the truth of it. Anna felt the weight of each year in Luca's lined face and greying hair, in the deep furrows at the corners of his eyes. She knew he saw the same in her, the way life had carved its mark all over those decades. Now, finally reunited, they felt that time collapse between them. The pain of those lost years was still there, but now, holding hands, they knew that even though they had missed so much, they still had this moment. "I used to wonder if I had imagined it," Luca admitted softly. "If I had only dreamed of you, of us." Anna squeezed his hand, her heart aching with the weight of those words. "It was real," she whispered, "every moment, even after all these years." They looked at each other, letting the years of waiting, of wondering, wash away. For the first time in 45 years, they didn't need to imagine or hold on to a memory. They were here, together, and in each other's gaze, they saw all the love they had endured across the decades. As the stars began to appear overhead, they stayed on the bench, their hands clasped tightly, content to finally have each other once more, even after all the years that had passed. And in that quiet moment, 45 years felt like nothing at all.